I'm Carolyn Cooper with CFIN, and I'm here today with Glenford Jameson, who is a lawyer and principal of the G.S. Jameson and Company law firm, which specializes in food and beverage industry law. Hi, Glenford.
Hi, Carolyn. How are you?
Good, thanks. Today we're talking about the laws and regulations surrounding cellular food. So, Glenford, maybe you can talk about what laws and regulations in Canada actually govern the research and development and import of cellular food in Canada.
Oof, there's a lot there, Carolyn. Good question. So I mean, the first thing is to try and define well, what are we actually talking about here? And there are a bunch of different technological breakthroughs in terms of food or cellular agriculture or precision fermentation or things that have a unique or new or developing process that leads to foods that frankly consumers are somewhat familiar with, right? Like the odd thing in this conversation is that like everyone kind of knows what a chicken breast looks like or a fish fillet or a steak or milk. And so that's all known. And what's being touted is that cellular agriculture or precision fermentation will bring you to foods that are indistinguishable at a genetic level from those that are currently available through traditional forms of agriculture. It's the process that's different, and so it's about creating a cell media and then getting a genetic component and then sort of creating those fats and proteins in a way that's indistinguishable from chicken breast or from what have you, or through some sort of fermentation process, getting enzymes to do some heavy lifting here. And so in those contexts, generally speaking, there's sort of two big frameworks that we think about. The first is sort of when we think about the consumer and what it means to consume these things. And so we've got the Food and Drugs Act in Canada, which is a great big act. It regulates medical devices and it regulates food and nutrition labeling and standards of identity and all kinds of good stuff. And we spend a lot of time in there. And the food and drug regulations are several hundred pages long, and it's a really serious document. Within the Food and Drugs Act, there's sort of there are two things that we take note of, and one is there's something called a novelty regulation. It used to be a division of the Food and Drug Regulations. Now it's its own regulation, and it tries to help us answer the question of whether a food is novel or not. And that's really meaningful because if a food is novel, then we need to figure out if it's safe. And if it isn't novel, then you know what? Like we probably have rules in place, and we can pip on. And novel food regulations. I mean, like this idea of working through novelty. Most recently came through a process in around 2000. I think it was 1999. And if you sort of situate yourself in that moment, you think, well, what were big issues from a food technology perspective in 1999. And that's kind of when everyone was thinking about genetic modification, right? And sort of moving away from selective breeding or atomic mutagenesis, so blasting seeds with radiation to try and get them to bring new traits to the fore. And instead, we were going to do some genetic modification. And so in Canada, we rushed and we got a novel foods process together so we could assess, like, is genetically modified wheat or corn or soy, like, are those novel or not? And that's sort of been kicking around ever since. And then from that novelty piece, if something is novel, and like the goalposts roughly for like whether something's novel or not, historically speaking, at least, are, is it part of substantial part of a population's diet? The population kind of needs to be like 1 million people, and it kind of needs to have been around for around 3 generations. And so like those are like pretty strong markers. And we've done novelty applications before, and they're always really interesting. Health Canada and CFIA have sort of 3 major desks of people, nutritional science folks, microbiologists, and then toxicologists or chemical safety folks, and they all get together in a room and they work through this. And it's remarkable progress. It's remarkable process, and it's really fact driven. They sort of seek a lot of data whether this thing should be novel or not. They ask good questions. If it is novel, then we have something called a pre-market safety assessment. Pre-market safety assessment does, kind of what you think it would do. Before you put something on the market, let's figure out if it's safe or not. It takes a couple of years. It's really expensive. It's frustrating for those who go through it. CFIA recently put out a document in one of their regulatory roadmaps that said, look, like we promised this is going to take, I think it's like 250 days, and it never does. It takes way longer, and it's really hard to sort of assess like what this process kind of looks like for anyone, including us internally, but like for external stakeholders, we've heard a lot of frustration, and that's been our experience as well. But that's kind of like at a very high level of the process within the Food and Drugs Act. There's a secondary act that is, equally, if not more important, under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. Now, that act is also from around the turn of the century, right? So we're thinking about biotechnology and like what were the issues that are sort of front and center in that moment. And again, it's sort of genetic engineering issues, right? Like what does it mean to take a genome and modify it and then put it in the wild? And again, you think in those moments, you're thinking about wheat, you're thinking about corn, you're thinking about crops primarily that are propagated through wind, right? And sort of like seed is in the air and pollen is in the air, and like how do you prevent a native crop from being crossbred with a genetic engineered crop? And like these are sort of the ideas and problems that we're thinking about with the CEPA, as we call it, so the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. In that act, they have they've got two big regulations. They've got a bunch of regulations, but they've got two big regulations as they pertain to us. And so the first is the New Substance Notification Regulations, or NSNR, for organisms. And then the next is the New Substances Notification Regulations for chemicals and polymers. And this is kind of where we start to think about like what did the drafters intend when they built this, and how well is this situated to deal with something like cellular agriculture. Now, the organisms one, which is like kind of like how you think the Environment and Climate Change Canada would like work through whether cellular agriculture works or not, right? Like we're working on a genome. We're not working on something that's living, but we're working on something that notionally was or could be part of a living animal. But it's very clear. It says, like it needs to be relevant to an animate organism, or something that's living. And so oddly, a lot of the cell ag stuff, the precision fermentation stuff perhaps, but like the cellular agricultural stuff doesn't fit at all in that regulation. But that regulation sets out like what is the safety protocols? Like how do we assess and how do we analyze whether something should go out in the wild? When do we need to notify the minister or the government and have a meeting with them and explain to them what we're doing and explain that it's safe? When does that need to happen? And those sorts of things. Similarly, there's this new substances notification regulation for chemicals and polymers. Again, doesn't really capture what we're doing. It's really helpful in terms of cell medium and then sort of the chemicals and polymers that are going to support the cells, like what they're going to be printed on. But in terms of the actual product itself, not super helpful. Certainly, we've got something called the domestic substances list that will sort of set out like approved substances changing all the time, that will assess whether that media is acceptable or not. And there's a lot of innovation that's happening in that area because when we're working on cell ag, we're really trying to get to, for a lot of vegans or ethical vegans, we're trying to get something that's actually like vegan meat, right? So a lot of cell media is derived from animals, and so we're seeing a lot of innovation in that space. But anyway, and that goes through a process. It goes through a process of assessing whether something is effectively safe to go into the environment. And so those are sort of the two main places that we're seeing change. Now, Health Canada and Environment and Climate Change Canada, like these are two organizations, A, that are massive, and B, they're like keenly aware that this is something that we need to figure out. And again, when I'm speaking about this, I'm really primarily speaking about that cell ag, in vitro meat, lab grown meat. And so certainly there's an awareness that like there is relevant legislation, the intention is great, the wording is not so great. And so what do we do with these guys? And so Health Canada recently put together a framework or guidelines for novel foods that have been genetically edited, right? So sort of
Mm,
CRISPR-Cas like been
okay.
sort of the forefront of genetic modification, but it was really about plants. And so right now, what they're doing is they're developing a new regulatory framework uh, for the assessment of products regulated under the Food and Drugs Act, um, uh, that are animal based, and so that's something that's developing and it's to come. And so it should give us a lot more guidance in terms of how this is going to progress. But in terms of like the source of the legislation and like what we can expect, there's sort of that major piece in the Food and Drugs Act, the pre-market safety assessment, novelty assessment. Almost certainly, in vitro meat is going to be novel. And sort of a big question is like for the 10th submission that might be just slightly tweaked, like will that also be novel? We're not sure. And then the permanent safety assessment, and then on the environmental protection side, we're looking at a process that these ministries have essentially said, like, look, like this is the way that we expect to do it. We don't really have something in place, so do the best you can, and we're going to develop some policy. I think like the best way to think about like all of this is, I mean, it's almost like being a nuclear scientist in the late 1940s, right? It's like everyone's freaked out. No one really knows how this stuff works. We can see there's
Hmm.
tremendous opportunity and power here. We're trying to scale this. We're trying to figure out how to make a power plant out of this stuff. We're trying to figure out how not to weaponize it. Trying to figure out how to weaponize it. Trying to figure out how to make it safe, how to deal with waste, and those sorts of
Hmm.
things. Like in this context, it's like it seems benign. There's incredible possibilities in the same way that there's incredible possibilities with nuclear power. At the same time, we don't really know what the impact of this stuff is.
Right.
And while there's like an incredible thrust on the impact, if it's scalable, to reduce carbon and to really change how global diets interact with meat, and ethically how we think about animal protein. Right now, it's all kind of unknown. And it presents just a lot of interesting problems, both from a regulatory perspective, and then, I mean, frankly, from an intellectual property perspective, right? So this obligation to share, but not to share.
Hmm.
I mean, an example under the new substances notification regulations, both of them, they both have exemptions in terms of needing to like go to a minister and say like, hey, like we've developed something wacky here that's like not something that exists anywhere else.
Hmm.
But like so long as it's done for research and development, you don't really need to go forward until you start producing. I think the limit, as long as you're in a containment facility, for organisms is 1,000 liters, and for chemicals and polymers is something like 250 kilos. So, and that's if it's not already sort of like in the realm of Environment Canada being aware. So there's a while before you to go and engage the regulators. At the same time, I mean, something that's really amazing, specifically in Canada as compared to different jurisdictions, is um, Environment Canada will take a meeting with you and give you a lot of guidance. And so they will take sort of pre-notification meetings and help walk through like, here are our concerns, here's what we're going to want to see from you, like in terms of the ultimate submission, like when it's time, when you're ready, when you've broken out of figuring out what media works well, like how to produce this at this sort of scale, you're ready to sort of think about commercializing this. Then like
Hmm.
here's what the process looks like, here's what you can expect from us, and then here's how we sort of manage that piece. And the same is true with Health Canada, CFIA, and the pre-market safety assessment.
Okay.
They will take meetings. They will give you some guidance, which is great.
So, do you think we're likely to see these products on the market as novel foods before there's actual regulations specifically covering them?
I mean, like so, like they're how we place it. So in vitro meat, like sort of like if you think of it in terms of a flow chart, the first question is it novel or not? And if it's novel, then the next question is it safe? And so strictly speaking, from that food and drugs perspective, the novelty assessment doesn't take that long. And like frankly, for whoever the first person is or first entity is that submits, like it will be novel because it's a novel process. And we think about sort of the history of what's been novel. And sometimes it's the actual entity. So genetic engineered grains, for example, but sometimes it's the process. Look at like high
Right.
pressure processing was a big issue like 15 years ago. And they spent a lot of time thinking about like, okay, like HPP stuff, like how do we deal with this? Like, what are the food safety concerns? This is different. Uh, anyway, I'll have to say that the novelty assessment takes a little bit of time, but the pre-market safety assessment takes quite a bit of time, and it is
Right.
truly a data-driven exercise. And like there are really basic questions that need to be answered that are really important. Does this like provide the same bioavailability as regular meat? Does it spoil at the same rate? Like is are there the potential for potential like pathogens that exist here that don't exist elsewhere?
Mm.
I mean, like I think about how regulated beef is in Canada, and after the BSE crisis in the 2000s, um, uh, doing anything with beef is well. I mean, there are a couple different pieces to this. Like BSE is a large part of it. Listeria crisis is also a different like sort of food safety issue, but and then XL. But like even from just BSE, right, which is about preventing prions, so folded proteins that present like the most terrifying diseases that humanity could ever imagine from entering into our supply chain, and they're
Right.
propagated by animals eating animals that have proteins that are prions. And so, how do we prevent that? So, I remember working years ago on a company that wanted to sell a suet ball that had
Mm.
birdseed on it. You know, you
Mm-hmm.
sort of picture, okay, so you hang it off a tree or what have you, and birds eat it. It's got lots of fat. It's got seeds. It's kind of a win for everyone. And in order to bring those into Canada, the documentation that we needed was significant, including documentation from the veterinarian that ran the rendering facility for the plant, information about the animals that were being rendered, and that's all so that we prevent something like a prion entering our food system inadvertently and then becoming a massive problem. Keep in mind that shut Canada's border for beef to the United States for a significant period of time.
Mm-hmm.
So like there's a lot of caution here on the environmental side that would sort of end up in the more environmental
Right.
side, but also in the human side. We just don't know, right? So um, in Europe, our European friends really focus on something called the precautionary principle, which is like let's like take a good look at something before we green light it. Like let's not like learn on the fly. Like let's not build the plane while we fly it.
Right.
In Canada and in the U.S., like we don't observe the precautionary principle in the same way. It's actually rooted in law in the European Union. In Canada, like we see glimpses of it here and there. One was on genetically engineered salmon
Mm-hmm.
about 10 years ago, or maybe a little less than that, maybe like 2016, something like that. But like judges have been slow to sort of articulate like, hey, like there's something to like a wait and see approach here. And our legislators don't really do that either. I mean, another
Mm-hmm.
example might be of a similar approach would be neonicotinoids as pesticides and how they might be affecting our bee population in Ontario, right? And so in Ontario, we sort of shut that down on the
Mm-hmm.
basis that the science didn't seem to be settled, but there seemed to be some sort of link between honey production, bees, pollinators, and then the use of this product, this group of products. And so for us, like that's kind of I think what we can expect from a regulatory perspective. I mean, if I was in this industry and I ran a cell ag company, I mean, like one of the questions that I would have is, I mean, like there are a bunch. I would have like, how do I protect my IP through this process? It's sort of its own thing. But practically speaking, like why would I even bother dealing with the Canadian framework when like really the U.S. and the FDA is what's going to matter? Or alternatively, like Asian countries seem to have their stuff together on this topic. Like Singapore has sort of been a
Mm-hmm.
leader in this space, which is really interesting. And the trade organizations that are coming out of Asia as relates to cultivated meat, like really seem to be sort of focused on standardizing the industry, figuring out a way to give it some nomenclature, right? Like so that consumers understand what it is. And then also like how regulators can understand it. And unfortunately, the practical effect of being a Canadian business is you need to work within the rules of Canadian laws and regulations. And the great thing about Canada is that, and like I say this like as a proud Canadian, but objectively as someone who works with a lot of international clients, like CFIA, Health Canada, like these are agencies that are respected more than I think anybody. There are agencies in
Absolutely.
the world as it relates
Right.
to food. The Economist put out a report maybe 2 years ago that said effectively that, and we see that when we work with ingredient suppliers, for example, that go to different countries, like we're just treated differently. But because of that, we have a really high bar in terms of what's compliant and how to think
Hmm.
through it. So, so in terms of are we? This is a very long and sort of abstract way of getting to like, are we going to see like cultivated meat, in vitro meat on our shelves before they go through a novelty process? No. Are we going to see it before they go through before the products go through pre-market safety assessment? No. Is this going to be dealt with lightly in the same way that, I mean, we kind of, like in Canada, we regulate health products, like natural health products and homeopathic remedies, but at the same time, like the TikTok universe exists where we make wild claims about them and see all kinds of like fairly unregulated content. No, this is going to be taken very seriously,
Hmm.
and I think that this is really serious stuff.
So it'll be a
Um,
few years at least.
yeah, I think so.
Hmm.
I mean, that being said, I think that like the practical barrier is how to scale this stuff and how to scale this stuff reliably, and then after you scale it, how do you get your yields up, right? Like just because we're not raising hens, we're not raising chickens, doesn't mean that like we can just sort of like fire a line together and make this work. Like the amount of capital investment that's going to go into this is going to be significant, and the amount of R&D once we even figure out how to make this at scale is going to be significant in terms of making sure that prices are reasonable and that quality assurance is there, and then also like how to sell this stuff and how to bring it to market. Like there's a lot of question marks, right? Like I really like it's like a great and awful example, but it is like those who are in these countries working on this problem are the nuclear physicists
Mm.
of the 1940s. Like we just
Right.
there's
Of
just
the new industry.
um, it's a totally new industry with new rule. I mean, with
Hmm.
unclear rules and no clear pathway. I mean, something that's really interesting when you think about an assessment of novelty is like we all think like, oh, well, once it's assessed novel or not, then like as soon as the first one that goes through this prerequisite safety assessment, well, then it'll kind of be settled, and then they're the first ones through the wall, and then everyone after that would sort of like flood in, and it'll be much easier. But the answer is like, I don't know if that's the case. Like, I think that um, everyone, I mean, not everyone, but I think there may be like 4 or 5 or 10 or 20 different ways of doing this that may all have a sufficiently different process
Hmm.
that it may require a new sort of approach from the regulator every time.
Hmm.
And so it may be clear like what goalposts you need to hit in terms of safety and in terms of what you need to demonstrate. But I don't think
Hmm.
that there's a shortcut. I think that you're still going to have to demonstrate uh, a lot of thoughtful materials to the regulator before you can access
Hmm.
the market. All
Hmm.
of this again is like in vitro meat, like the precision fermenting stuff is like a little easier to handle, right? Like fermentation as a process is ancient and generally speaking natural, and precision fermenting is different, but it's an iteration on a theme. It's not 3D printing like
And
self.
again, there's no living cells involved, so or
Well, I mean, like
animal
fermentation
cells.
is an alive process, right? So
Right.
like inherently, I mean, it's even more alive than the cellular process or like the cell ag process because you're asking microbes and enzymes to live and to thrive
Mm.
and then to stop and to
Right.
produce a very specific thing. But the difference is that like since time immemorial, we've had grapes turn to wine and berries turn boozy, and we've seen birds getting drunk, and like this is all sort of primordial
Right.
like life, right? So like from a fermentation perspective, like what's changing is again sort of the notion of precision, and the big problem that we have there is, I mean, depending on how it's being done, obviously it's all very like 30,000 feet. But the problem there is like trying to figure out how to label it, right? And like the
Hmm.
really curious thing is again like our acts, like our legislation, our regulations in Canada, they really do speak to like these agricultural concepts, like what's milk? Well, it needs to come
Hmm.
uh, from a gland that produces dairy. Like that's what it is. That's what it comes from. Like your
So the
crushed
very
up almonds,
definitions
your
are
crushed up
changing.
soy. It's like that's
Right.
or if they're not changing, then like we can be really clear about what they are. And like what's been really interesting
Hmm.
in Canada, and I have to give CFIA a lot of kudos for this, is I remember doing something with the Globe and Mail, I think it was 7 years ago, I think, about cashew cheese. And CFI had really taken like a hard position on a company out of BC that was making,
Mm-hmm.
frankly, wonderful vegan cheese. And at that point in time, they're just like, absolutely, you may not. You may not call that like cheese. You may not call it
Mm-hmm.
dairy based. And like where they landed in their negotiation was something like really hilarious, like 100% dairy free, non dairy containing
Mm-hmm.
cashew cheese. And from there, there's sort of been a slippery slope as the consumer has evolved to naming things to where we are now. Like I was in
Mm-hmm.
a place called Cheese Boutique that had plant-based butter, and it just that's what it was called. And if you had told me that 7 years ago, I would have said that the CFIA would have rounded up all of that stuff, demanded it was repackaged, and then sent it back into the market.
Mm-hmm.
Something that's really cool about naming things in Canada is there are standardized names. So like, and this is like sort of the issue, right? It's like cheese, milk, all those dairy things. They really do tie back to like a glandular process involving an animal. But if the sort of the public's understanding, the consumer's understanding shifts, then names need to shift with that. And so I think that they've done a really, like, frankly, good job of managing plant-based products that have come in that seem to mimic those things. There
So,
was a consultation on simulated meat products like a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, that was really interesting in that they have a regulation for, or they've got like some regulatory rules that they follow in the food and drugs regs about simulated meat. And the question was just like, do we have to change these regs, or can we just change how we interpret them? And I thought that was really telling. Anyway, so
okay, great. That was a really good explanation of the current regulatory landscape regarding cellular food. Is there anything else you wanted to add that we didn't talk about today?
well, look, I mean, like I could yarn for a while on this stuff. So why don't we put a cork in it, so to speak, and let's do this again in a couple of weeks. Again, like so, we're filming this at the very end of January in 2023, and we're eagerly anticipating some more guidance documents and a regulatory framework from Health Canada to start to be
Great.
circulated. And so our expectation is like who knows when it comes out, but soon we should have a lot more like sort of like really substantive material to draw from instead of a lot of these regulations that are 25 years old and
Mm-hmm.
not designed to work in this universe with this level of science. So,
Great. We'll look forward to talking again. Thanks, Glenford.
awesome. Thanks, Carolyn. Take care.
Bye.